The Chernobyl exclusion zone is one of the most unique places on the planet. Once a model town of the Soviet Union, it has sat largely unchanged since the nuclear disaster in 1986, and as such is a fascinating time capsule of Soviet life, as well as a glimpse into a post-apocalyptic world. But understandably, the radiation and the history of this place mean that a lot of people would prefer to explore it online rather than in person. So let me share with you what it's like to walk around the most famous ghost city in the world.
There has been a nuclear accident in the Soviet Union, and the Soviets have admitted that it happened.
We do know that a zone of deadly radiation is being released from the damaged plant, and the accident is far from over.
The fire spews out huge amounts of radiation. Meanwhile, the workers and others in the area who are exposed to intense radiation can be expected to suffer various symptoms. For some, there will probably be immediate death from destruction of the nervous system. Others will suffer bleeding, blistering of the skin, and intestinal and bone marrow damage, which can kill.
What the Soviets have experienced is a nuclear meltdown.
The exclusion zone covers a 30-kilometre radius from the site of the 1986 disaster. Within that are the ruins of unfinished reactors, many small towns, a secret military installation, and the famous town of Pripyat. In the 80s, the area was home to some 50,000 people, but when we walked around, it felt like we were the only ones there. My friend Nuri and I are in the zone for 5 days to film a documentary with one of the first responders to the disaster. But we'll also be exploring as much of the zone as we can, to learn about life in the town before 86, visit the places that tell the story of the disaster, and capture as much as we can before the sites are lost to the elements. To enter the zone, you need to have a permit and pass daily radiation checks. But on top of that, you also need to be accompanied by a guide at all times to make sure you don't wander off into high radiation. Safety was paramount for us, and having that local with us to keep us out of harm's way meant we were never exposed to dangerous radiation throughout our trip. The first place you come to when you enter the exclusion zone is the town of Chernobyl itself. Now, confusingly, it isn't the famous ruins that you often see in photos or videos. That's Pripyat. Chernobyl is further away from Reactor 4 than Pripyat, and as a result is only partially abandoned. Most tourists who visit the exclusion zone do day trips from Kiev, but as we were filming for 5 days, we needed somewhere to stay. Chernobyl houses the only hotel in the exclusion zone, so that's where we ate and slept during our stay. The facilities are comparable to a nice hostel in the West. The rooms are old but clean. There's a small restaurant and bar that seats about 20 in there where locals and tourists drink together. The whole thing feels very much like an Old West saloon. It's a good experience. Walking around Chernobyl, you're unlikely to run into anyone except animals. The memorials to the fallen are erected here. The firefighters. The displaced towns. A church still holds services on the edge of town. But to see firsthand the places affected most by the disaster, we need to head deeper into the zone, to the ruins of Pripyat. In 1986, Pripyat was considered a model Soviet metropolis. Built primarily for the workers of the power plants, it actually still contained a lot of buildings similar to many you'd find in Europe or America. There were schools, apartments, restaurants, gyms. Places you visit where you live today are similar to what the citizens of Pripyat visited. Which is why walking around these ruins feels so eerie, because this could be your town. A lot has changed in the decades since Reactor 4 exploded. My first impression on entering Pripyat is how quickly nature has reclaimed the space. There are trees everywhere.
And this used to just be a normal street, no trees. Yep.
When compared to archival footage of these streets prior to the disaster, it's almost unrecognisable. which makes me curious to see if there's much that remains of the facilities that played a role on the night of the disaster. Shortly after the explosion on April 26, 1986, firefighters stationed here rushed out to the emergency. They of course had no idea they were heading to a nuclear disaster, and so when the fires on the roof of the reactors had been extinguished, the majority of the men didn't return here, but went straight to hospital instead. Hours later, it was through these doors that the 108 injured and irradiated firefighters and plant workers were taken. By this time, there was still no announcement about the disaster having been made, so doctors and nurses had no idea how dangerous these patients were. This hospital was the busiest building in Pripyat up until the moment of evacuation, and even today it's apparent it was abandoned suddenly. Much remains intact and in place. The maternity ward on the ground floor, with cradles for newborns. Medical equipment still remains in a lot of the rooms, as well as medicine, medical journals, and records. There was only one floor of the hospital where we didn't go, the basement. That's because the clothes that the firemen and plant workers wore that night still lie in a room down there, too contaminated to be moved and far too dangerous for us to visit. Just over the road is the old morgue. Now, I'm unsure if this was in use during the disaster, but much of the apparatus remains, including a cabinet full of vials. The Pripyat police station was a hive of activity following the disaster. They helped with the evacuations and removal of key assets in the town. But today it's one of the darkest ruins in the city. These jail cells, forever open, are completely intact. The heavy steel doors and bars still in good condition. Abandoned vehicles are strewn behind the station. Buses, trucks, cars, military vehicles. Some possibly used by liquidators, now flipped, rusted away, and invisible amongst the trees. But what about the actual site of the disaster, the power plant? The destroyed reactor is now safely contained within this sarcophagus, and although it's possible to arrange visits inside to the control room of Reactor 4, I was more interested in getting an idea of what it would have looked like before it was entombed. At the time of the nuclear disaster, 2 additional plants were almost finished construction, and today lie abandoned with cranes and building supplies scattered around. Approaching via an old, overgrown path, these gigantic ruins give a good idea about what Reactor 4 would have looked like during construction. No nuclear material was ever installed here, but we chose not to venture too far inside as the floor didn't look that stable. Had reactors 5 and 6 been completed, cooling towers would have been needed to handle the additional water, hence this enormous unfinished construction. From inside you can still see the builder's scaffolding at the top of the tower, but parts of it are starting to fall away, along with panels from the tower itself. When the order to evacuate was finally given, people were falsely assured that they would be returning in 3 days, so the town left behind remained as it was. But time has not been kind to Pripyat. Since being abandoned, it has been looted, vandalized, and then exposed to the elements for decades. This is where the toddlers would play. Their beloved dolls, their building blocks, a teacher's logbook. Some photos of the students remain faded amongst the debris and gas masks. These were scattered in buildings throughout Pripyat and, I suspect, put here by photographers, but originally these would have been stored for use in case the Cold War got hot. Kids in Pripyat had a number of schools to choose from, but middle school number 3 is probably the best preserved. A lot of the classrooms are in similar shape to how they were left, and it's a really fascinating time capsule of Soviet school life. For instance, these are the textbooks they used, many with Soviet iconography throughout, now strewn about the hallways. Science experiments continue to be preserved in jars. This is the old assembly hall. The piano that played the national anthem and school songs sits wrecked by the side. The old school cafeteria is where you'll find the famous litter of gas masks. Now, these were originally stored in crates at the top of the school, but vandals and then photographers placed them here, so we could all get this creepy shot. Across the road sits one of the most famous ruins of the zone. Originally the school's gymnasium and pool, it was amazingly in use for a full decade after the accident by liquidators and workers. But of course, it's hard to tell as the building is in the same derelict condition as the rest of Pripyat. The centre of town has a lot of iconic buildings. There's the hotel, a supermarket, some impressive apartment buildings, but the focus is usually drawn to the Palace of Culture. Essentially a recreational centre with a dose of propaganda, you'd find one of these in most Soviet towns. Inside has been completely stripped, but you can see the remains of some of the facilities here, like a basketball court, a boxing ring, and I think a cinema. Outside the building stands the remains of the fairground. At the time of the accident, these attractions had been built but not opened, so they have forever remained unused. Near to the hospital sits the remains of another gymnasium. Sport was a big part of Soviet culture, and it's easy to imagine the groups of children that once used these facilities. These days though, the floor is rotting through, and walking around here was a bit treacherous. Just down the road, hidden amongst the trees, is the remains of Cafe Pripyat. By all accounts, one of the most popular and scenic spots in the city. There's not a whole lot left of it except for some vending machines and the remains of the once beautiful stained glass. Boats used to dock here, taking people up and down the river. All gone now, save for one half sunk nearby. Out of town and amongst the woods lies the remains of a children's summer camp. Some of the paintings on the buildings had survived when we visited, but the wooden structures were starting to collapse. And in April 2020, a forest fire swept through the area and finished the job. In the woods to the south of Pripyat stands a massive military installation that was shrouded in mystery until the fall of the Soviet Union. This 700-meter-long radar installation was part of the Soviets' early warning defense system, designed to detect incoming nuclear attacks. A series of support buildings lie abandoned near the radar, largely stripped but still interesting to explore. Electrical equipment and machinery still sits within, along with the remains of a training facility. The history of the cities we live in today are mostly buried beneath it. Even in the space of 30 or 40 years, buildings get torn down, factories converted into apartments, streets removed to make way for train stations. But that will never be the case in the exclusion zone. By the time Chernobyl is safe to inhabit again, all of this will have crumbled to the ground. It's already starting to happen. But until then, it remains a fascinating Soviet time capsule to explore, and a glimpse into a world where humans have left.